in the unforgiving dust of the 1883 Arizona Territory, where survival was a currency, paid in sweat and blood. One life hung by a thread, sinking slowly into the earth. The life of a Navajo warrior, a stranger, an enemy to the people of Redemption Gulch. And the person who found him wasn't a hardened gunslinger or a cavalry scout, but a slip of a girl, an orphan with nothing to her name but grit. The choice she made in that moment, to help or to flee, would do more than save one man. 5 days later, it would bring an entire nation to the doorstep of her town. Not for war, but for a reason no one least of all her could have ever predicted. This is the story of that choice and the reckoning that followed. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Arizona Territory, beating down on the cracked earth and bleaching the very life from the landscape. For 16-year-old Kaylee Ellison, the heat was just another layer of the oppressive silence that defined her existence. She was an orphan, a ghost haunting the edges of Redemption Gulch, a town that was itself dying a slow, thirsty death. The silver vein that had given the town its hopeful name had run dry years ago, leaving behind a husk of false-fronted buildings and men whose dreams had turned to dust in their mouths. Kaylee's guardian, if one could call him that, was her mother's brother, a man named Horace Bartholomew. Mr. Bartholomew ran the town's general store, a repository of stale crackers, overpriced canned goods, and his own curdled resentment. He had taken her in after the cholera epidemic of '79, had claimed her parents, and he never let her forget the burden she represented. Every meal was a debt, every glance a reprimand. Her only solace was the wilderness, not the town with its wary eyes and whispered judgments, but the sprawling, dangerous beauty of the desert beyond. There she was not Bartholomew's charity case. She was just Abby, a silent observer, a student of the land. She knew which plants held water, how to read the tracks of a jackrabbit, and where the buzzards circled when death was near. It was this knowledge, this intimate connection to the harsh land, that led her to Coyote Creek on that blistering Tuesday afternoon. The creek was mostly a lie, a ribbon of sun-baked sand for most of the year. But recent unseasonable rains had turned patches of it into a treacherous mire, a hidden trap of quicksand that looked no different from the surrounding ground. She was tracking a Gila monster, fascinated by its lazy, beaded progress, when a sound snagged her attention. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the shriek of a hawk. It was a low, guttural grunt of effort, followed by the wet, sucking sound of mud. Peering through a thicket of brittle bush, Kaylee's heart leaped into her throat. There, not 20 yards away, was a man. He was sunk to his waist in the grey, viscous slurry of the creek bed. He was Navajo. Every instinct, honed by the town's ingrained fear, screamed at her to run. The Navajo, or the Dene as they called themselves, were a source of constant low-grade terror in Redemption Gulch. Sheriff Cole Garrett, a man whose ambition was as vast as his cruelty made sure of it. He spoke of raids of stolen livestock, of the savage threat that loomed just beyond the treaty lines. The townsfolk, desperate for someone to blame for their misfortunes, ate it up. To them, a Navajo was a threat, plain and simple. But Kaylee saw something else. She didn't see a savage. She saw a man, his face a mask of strained exhaustion, his dark eyes wide with a primal fear she recognized. It was the fear of being alone and helpless, a fear she knew intimately. He was strong. His bare arms and shoulders were corded with muscle, and a beautiful turquoise necklace lay stark against his sweat-sheened skin. But the quicksand was stronger. Every time he struggled, it sucked him deeper. He had a rope, a lariat of braided horsehair, but the nearest solid anchor, a gnarled mesquite root, was just out of his reach. He would thrash grunt and sink another inch, the mud greedily claiming him. She watched for a full minute, her mind a battlefield. Mr. Bartholomew's voice echoed in her head, spitting warnings about redskins. Sheriff Garrett's smug, cold face swam in her vision. Let him die, a part of her whispered. It's not your business. It's safer, but then the man's head slumped forward in defeat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was giving up. He was choosing to die. And Kaylee, who had fought every day just to exist, could not stand to watch it. Taking a deep breath, she broke from cover. The man's head snapped up his eyes instantly, wary, hostile. He saw a scrawny girl in a faded calico dress, her blonde hair bleached by the sun and tied back with a piece of twine. He didn't relax. "Don't move," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. It was a stupid thing to say. Of course he couldn't move. She corrected herself. "Stop fighting it. You'll only sink faster." He stared at her, saying nothing. His silence was a wall. She could see the handle of a knife tucked into his deerskin leggings. He didn't trust her, and he had no reason to. Kaylee scanned her surroundings, her mind working with the pragmatic clarity the wilderness had taught her. The mesquite root was the key. His rope was too short. But there were other resources. Her eyes landed on a long dead branch of a palo verde tree, bleached white by the sun. It was thick and sturdy. "I'm going to help you," she stated, more to convince herself than him. She pointed to the branch, then to him, then to the root. She mimed tying her own rope, a simple length of hemp she always carried to the branch, and pushing it to him. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Getting the branch was a struggle. It was heavy and awkward, but she managed to drag it to the edge of the mire. She securely tied her hemp rope around one end. Now came the most dangerous part. She had to get close enough to pass it to him without getting trapped herself. She lay on her stomach, distributing her weight, and slowly, painstakingly pushed the branch out over the quicksand. It wasn't long enough. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than suspicion. It was a shared, desperate frustration. He pointed with his chin toward his own lariat, then at the end of her branch. He wanted her to create a chain. It was a risk. He could use the rope to pull her in. The thought sent a cold spike of fear through her. But looking at his face, at the profound weariness etched around his eyes, she made her choice. She trusted him. Slowly, with great effort, he managed to uncoil his lariat and toss the looped end toward her. It fell short. He tried again, and again. Sweat poured down his face, his muscles quivering with the strain. On the fourth try, the loop landed on the very tip of the palo verde branch. Carefully, Kaylee worked it down until it was secure. Now they had a connection. She crawled back to the solid ground, her heart pounding. She looped her end of the hemp rope around the thickest part of the mesquite root, pulling it taut. "Now," she called out. "Pull slowly, use the branch to lift." He understood. He gripped the wooden branch, and using it as a lever, he began to work his body upward, coordinating his pulls with the rhythm of his breathing. Kaylee, for her part, held the rope with all her might, her small frame braced against the root, her knuckles white. The mud made a grotesque releasing sound with every inch he gained. It was agonizingly slow. The sun beat down. Insects buzzed in the oppressive air. The only sounds were his strained breaths and the sucking of the sand. It took the better part of an hour. Finally, with one last desperate heave, he pulled his hips free. He was crawling now, exhausted, moving like a wounded animal through the shallows until he collapsed onto the hard, dry bank covered in grey sludge, trembling violently. Kaylee didn't approach him. She stayed by the root, her own body shaking with adrenaline and relief. For a long time he just lay there, his chest heaving. When he finally pushed himself up to a sitting position, he looked at her. The hostility was gone, replaced by a deep, soul-shaking weariness, and something else. Something that looked like awe. He spoke, his voice a low gravel. The words were in his own tongue, the Diné language, and she didn't understand them. But the tone was universal. It was a tone of profound, unbelievable gratitude. He then switched to broken, heavily accented English. "You save me." Kaylee just nodded, suddenly feeling shy and overwhelmed. "You were stuck." He looked at the setting sun, then back at her. He knew, and she knew, that he would have died. Exposure, dehydration, or a predator would have claimed him by morning. He owed her his life. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. He was caked in drying mud, which was already cracking on his skin. He needed water. He needed rest. And he was miles from his own people in territory that was deeply hostile to him. "I am Kay," he said, touching his chest. "Kaylee," she replied softly. He nodded, committing the name to memory. He looked around at the vast, darkening landscape. He was vulnerable. Kaylee saw it, and the same protective instinct that had made her help him now surged again. She couldn't just leave him here. The sheriff and his men sometimes rode patrols this far out. If they found him weak and alone, they would kill him or drag him back to town to be made an example of. She thought of the small hidden cave she'd found a year ago, a fissure in a rock face half a mile away, concealed by a curtain of overgrown desert willow. It was dry and safe. "Come," she said, making a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. "I know a place. You can rest. It's safe." Kay looked at this strange, pale girl who had appeared from nowhere and pulled him from his grave. He saw no deception in her clear blue eyes. He saw only a strength that mirrored the harshness of the land she called home. With a slow, solemn nod, he agreed. He was putting his life in her hands for the second time in a single day. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, the orphan girl and the Navajo warrior disappeared into the shadows of the canyons, leaving the greedy mud of Coyote Creek behind them. The cave was exactly as Kaylee remembered, a cool, dark breath against the day's lingering heat. It was small, no bigger than the pantry in Mr. Bartholomew's store, but the floor was smooth stone, and it was utterly hidden from the outside world. She helped Kay inside his body, still trembling with exhaustion and the chill of the evaporating mud. For the first day, they barely spoke. Language was a barrier, but survival was a bridge. Kaylee knew he needed water above all else. She left him in the cave and made her way to a hidden seep spring she knew of, using a canteen she'd borrowed from the store months ago. When she returned, Kay was trying to scrape the caked mud from his skin with a flat stone. His movements were slow, pained. She offered him the canteen. He drank deeply, his eyes closing in gratitude. The water seemed to bring a sliver of his strength back. He looked at his muddied clothes and body with disgust. Kaylee understood. She pointed to a pool of relatively clear water downstream from the spring. He nodded, and with a quiet dignity limped out of the cave and toward the water to wash. While he was gone, Kaylee foraged. Her years of solitary exploration had made her a walking almanac of the desert's meager offerings. She gathered a handful of sweet mesquite beans, dug up the starchy roots of a yucca plant, and found a patch of wild onions. It wasn't a feast, but it was sustenance. By the time Kay returned cleaner, but still looking gaunt, she had a small, smokeless fire going in the deepest recess of the cave, using dry wood that wouldn't betray their position. She roasted the yucca root in the coals. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Kay watched her with an unnerving intensity. He was trying to understand her. Why had she helped him? What was a girl like her doing so far from the white man's town, so comfortable in this harsh world? Meanwhile, in Redemption Gulch, a different kind of fire was being stoked. Sheriff Cole Garrett stood on the porch of the saloon, a tall, imposing figure with a silver star pinned to a dusty black vest. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the faces of the anxious townsfolk. "He's been gone 2 days," a portly man named Peterson, who ran the smithy, declared. "Frank Miller ain't the type to just wander off. He went prospecting up near Coyote Creek, and he ain't come back." Frank Miller was a known drunk and a fool, but he was there, drunk and fool. Garrett let the tension build his expression grave. "I've seen tracks," he said, his voice carrying in the still air. "Unshod pony, heading east toward the nation." A murmur went through the crowd. It was the spark Garrett had been waiting for. For months, he'd been in secret correspondence with a Mr. Corrigan of the Arizona Land and Cattle Company. Corrigan had offered Garrett a substantial sum, enough to make him a king in this dying town if he could clear the nearby treaty lands. The company had geologists who believed a significant copper deposit lay under the Navajo grazing grounds, far more valuable than the played-out silver of Redemption Gulch. But they needed a reason, a justification to break the treaty and move in. A murdered prospector was the perfect excuse. Frank Miller conveniently had a habit of disappearing on drunken sprees. Garrett had simply encouraged him on a much longer one, paying him to lie low in a town 100 miles away. "They're getting bold," Garrett continued, his voice hardening. "They're crossing the treaty line, testing us. Now a man is missing. Are we going to let them pick us off one by one?" The crowd, fueled by fear and desperation, roared its denial. Horace Bartholomew stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pinched and sour. He hadn't seen Kaylee since yesterday morning. The girl was a constant source of irritation, always wandering off. He'd have to tan her hide when she finally slunk back. He listened to the sheriff nodding along. The Navajo were a good scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Back in the cave on the second day, Kay's strength began to return. The color was back in his face, and his movements were more fluid. He started to talk, pointing to objects, and giving her their Diné names. Tor for water, Chil for plant, Tse for rock. Kaylee, a quick learner, repeated them. In turn, she would give him the English word. It became a quiet game, a thread of understanding woven in the cool darkness. He finally asked the question that had been weighing on him. "Why? You help." Kaylee looked at the small fire. How could she explain the suffocating loneliness of her life? The feeling of being an outsider in her own town. The kinship she felt with the harsh, honest wilderness over the smiling, deceitful faces of people. "You were going to die," she said simply. "No one should die alone." The answer seemed to satisfy him. He nodded slowly. Later that day, He showed her his knife. It was a beautiful thing, the handle inlaid with silver and turquoise in a pattern of interlocking lines. He explained through a combination of words and gestures that it represented the bond between Nahima Mother Earth and Yardu Hu Father Sky. He was not a warrior he tried to convey. He was a Hata'owi in training a medicine man, a singer of the sacred chants. He had been on a solitary journey to find a specific plant, a rare mountain herb used in a healing ceremony when he had been tracking an eagle and stumbled into the creek. The revelation shifted Kaylee's perception of him. He was not just a man. He was a spiritual leader, a keeper of his people's ways. His life was important, not just to him, but to his entire community. That night, a fever took hold of him. A deep, racking cough shook his body, a consequence of inhaling the foul water of the quicksand. His breathing grew shallow and ragged. Panic seized Kaylee. She couldn't take him to Doc Albright in town. They'd hang him before the doctor could even look at him. She drew on her own knowledge. She remembered her mother during the cholera outbreak, brewing a tea from willow bark for the fever. It was a desperate memory, hazy with grief, but it was all she had. She left the feverish Kay in the cave and slipped out into the moonlight. She found a small stand of desert willow and stripped bark from the branches. Returning to the cave, she boiled it in the small pot she used for her foraged meals. She gently lifted Kay's head, urging him to drink the bitter tea. He was barely conscious, but he swallowed. Throughout the night, she bathed his face with a cool, damp cloth and made him drink more of the tea. She didn't sleep. She sat by his side, watching his chest rise and fall, her small fire, the only other living thing in the darkness. She was terrified. If he died here with her, his blood would truly be on her hands. She would be a murderer in the eyes of his people and a traitor in the eyes of her own. As dawn approached, his shivering subsided. The fever broke. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. Kaylee, exhausted, finally leaned her head against the cool stone wall and let her own eyes drift shut. She was awakened hours later by a hand on her shoulder. She jolted awake, her heart pounding. It was Kay. He was sitting up, his eyes clear. The fever was gone. He looked at the pot with the remnants of the willow bark tea, then at her. "You are a healer," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. He touched the turquoise necklace at his throat. It was made of dozens of small, perfectly shaped stones, strung together with silver beads. It was the most beautiful thing Kaylee had ever seen. With deliberate movements, he lifted it over his head. "No," Kaylee said, shaking her head, understanding his intent. "I don't want anything." "Is not payment," Kay insisted, his English more forceful than she had heard it. "Is bond. You have Kay kinship. You saved my life. Now I carry your deed. My people carry your deed. This is so you are known, so you are safe." He pressed the necklace into her hands. It was cool and heavy, a tangible piece of his world. She looked at the stones, then at his earnest face. To refuse would be a greater offense than to accept. She slowly looped it over her own neck, the stones feeling foreign and cool against her skin under her dress. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his face. "Kaya Deswood," he said, pointing to himself. It was his full name. "Kaylee Ellison," she replied. In that moment, something profound shifted between them. They were no longer just a white girl and a Navajo man. They were Kaya and Kaylee, Two people bound by an act of life-saving kindness in the heart of a hateful land. But outside their sanctuary, the storm Sheriff Garrett had unleashed was gathering force, and it was about to break right over their heads. On the morning of the fourth day, Kea knew he had to leave. His strength had returned, the fever was a ghost, and the debt he owed his people was heavy on his mind. The ceremony he was preparing for could not happen without him. "I must go," he told Kaylee. His gaze fixed on the sliver of bright sky visible from the cave's entrance. "My people will worry. They will think the worst." Kaylee's heart sank. The past few days in the cave had become a strange sort of home for her, a world away from the scorn of Mr. Bartholomew and the oppressive gloom of Redemption Gulch. Here with Kea, she was not a burden. She was a respected equal. The thought of returning to her old life was like a physical ache. "It's dangerous," she said, stating the obvious. "The sheriff, he's stirring up trouble. He's telling people a prospector was taken by the Navajo." Kea's face hardened. He had heard whispers of this sheriff, this Bilagaana Beyesh, the metal man, as some of the Dine called him for his shiny star and cold heart. "He looks for a reason to spill blood," Kea said, his voice low. "He wants the land under our feet. This missing man. It is a lie. They'll be looking for you, for any of your people." "Then I must be a shadow," he replied. He stood and gathered his few possessions, his knife, his empty water skin, the now clean lariat. He turned to her, his expression softening. "I will not forget this Kaylee Ellison. My family will not forget. My clan will not forget." She wanted to believe him, but his world felt a million miles away. "I'll guide you to the Three Sisters," she offered. "The rock formation. From there you can follow the dry wash all the way to the edge of your lands. It's hidden from the main trail." He nodded in gratitude. They left the cave, erasing any sign of their presence, and set off under the high morning sun. They moved in silence for a time, two small figures in a vast and indifferent landscape. It was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of farewell. When they reached the towering sandstone pillars known as the Three Sisters, they stopped. The lands of the Navajo Nation were a hazy blue line on the horizon. "Here," Kaylee said, her voice small. "Stay in the wash. You'll be safe." Kea turned to face her fully. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You have a strong heart, stronger than these rocks. Do not let your people's fear make it small." He then looked down at her simple calico dress. "Hide the necklace. Do not let them see it. It is for you, not for their eyes." Kaylee nodded, tucking the heavy turquoise stones beneath the collar of her dress. It felt like hiding a part of herself. "Be safe, Kea," she whispered. "You also," he replied, and with a final lingering look, he turned and melted into the landscape, his movements swift and sure, leaving Kaylee alone with the wind and the silence. The walk back to Redemption Gulch was the loneliest of her life. With every step, the oppressive weight of her reality settled back onto her shoulders, when the dusty, pathetic excuse for a main street came into view. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She didn't get 2 steps past the smithy before her uncle's hand clamped down on her arm like a vice. "Where have you been, girl?" Horace Bartholomew snarled, his breath smelling of stale coffee and anger. "Gallivanting about for 4 days while I worry myself sick." He wasn't worried. He was inconvenienced. "I was just Exploring, she stammered. Exploring. There's a savage on the loose, a man missing, and you're out exploring. He dragged her toward the general store. The sheriff has been asking questions. People are talking. They see the orphan girl who keeps to herself, who wanders the desert like a wild thing. It reflects poorly on me. He hauled her through the door of the store and into the dim, stiflingly hot back room. His eyes, small and hard, scanned her face, looking for any sign of defiance. You're a curse, that's what you are. Just like your father with his head in the clouds, and no mind for practical things. That's not true, Kaylee shot back, her spirit flaring. His face darkened at her tone. Don't you talk back to me. His eyes fell to her neck, where the lump of the necklace was barely visible under the fabric. Before she could react, he hooked a finger into her collar and yanked. The turquoise necklace came tumbling out, stark and brilliant against her pale skin. Bartholomew stared at it, his jaw dropping. He recognized the craftsmanship. It was Navajo work, and it was valuable. His eyes shot to her face, a dawning, monstrous suspicion twisting his features. Where did you get this? He breathed, his voice a venomous whisper. I found it. She lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. Liar, he spat. You were with him, weren't you? The savage. You've been with a Navajo. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. To him, there was only one reason a Navajo would give a white girl such a gift, a reason that made his blood run cold with shame and fury. Before she could deny it, Sheriff Garrett strode into the back room, his boots loud on the wooden floorboards. He'd seen Bartholomew drag Kaylee in, and his instincts for trouble were sharp. Having some family trouble, Horace. Bartholomew pointed a trembling finger at Kaylee. Look, he screeched, holding up the necklace for the sheriff to see. She's been with one of them for 4 days. This is how she pays for her keep, by consorting with savages. Garrett's cold eyes fixed on the necklace, then on Kaylee's terrified face. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. This was better than he could have ever planned. This was not just a justification. It was a rallying cry. So, the sheriff said softly, circling her like a predator. The little orphan girl has a secret friend. He snatched the necklace from Bartholomew's hand. This is fine work. A gift, was it, from the man who killed Frank Miller? He didn't kill anyone, Kaylee cried out, her fear eclipsed by a wave of protective fury. His name is Kea, and he was trapped. I saved his life. Garrett laughed, a short, ugly sound. You saved him. A likely story. I think you guided him. I think you helped him escape. You're a traitor, girl, a traitor to your own kind. He turned to Bartholomew. She knows where they are. She can lead us right to them. Kaylee's blood ran cold. No, I won't. Oh, I think you will, Garrett said smoothly. But then another better idea formed in his mind. Taking her would be complicated, but leaving her behind, after whipping the town into a frenzy with the story of her betrayal, that was far more potent. Lock her up, Horace, Garrett commanded. Put her in the cellar. Don't let her out until we get back. We have a posse to form. The cellar, Bartholomew stammered, looking suddenly fearful. Do it, Garrett ordered, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Or I'll start asking questions about your ledger books. That was enough. The color drained from Bartholomew's face. He grabbed Kaylee's arm again, his grip now desperate. He dragged her, kicking and protesting, to the heavy wooden door of the root cellar at the back of the store. Uncle, please, don't do this, she begged. You're sending them to their deaths. They haven't done anything!" He wouldn't meet her eyes. He shoved her into the damp, dark space, and with a heavy thud, slid the thick iron bolt into place. Kaylee was plunged into darkness. She heard the sheriff's boots stride out of the store, followed by his voice booming in the street outside. "Ring the Belltown meeting. Get your rifles, men. We ride at dawn. We've found our traitor, and she's shown us the way." She heard the town bell begin to toll a slow, mournful peal that sounded like a death knell. Down in the cold, musty dark, Kaylee beat her fists against the unyielding wood of the cellar door, her cries swallowed by the earth. She had saved one man's life, and in doing so she had just condemned an entire people to face the wrath of Redemption Gulch. The posse was coming. The darkness of the cellar was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It smelled of damp earth, the sweet decay of forgotten potatoes, and the sharp, metallic tang of despair. For hours, Kaylee was a prisoner, not just of the bolted door, but of the sounds that filtered through the floorboards from the world above. Each sound was a torment. The heavy tramp of boots on the porch of the general store. The excited, angry shouts of men, emboldened by liquor, and lies, the clean, menacing clink of rifles being checked and loaded. Each sound was another nail being hammered into the coffin of the fragile peace she had tried to protect. Her uncle's betrayal was a wound that cut deeper than any fear of the dark. He hadn't just imprisoned her. He had actively chosen the sheriff's poisonous narrative over his own blood. He had looked at her, seen the truth in her eyes, and cast it aside for the sake of his pathetic standing in a dying town. The final complete abandonment by her only family left an icy void in her chest where fear had been. That void quickly filled with something else, something cold and hard as stone resolve. She would not be the catalyst for a slaughter. She would not let Kaya's people pay the price for her act of kindness. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Pushing herself up from the dirt floor, she began to move her hands outstretched, mapping the geography of her prison. They swept across damp stone walls, slick with a fine layer of condensation, until they brushed against the rough grain of wood. It was an old, forgotten storage crate, half-rotted and falling apart. She hooked her fingers under a loose board, pulling with a strength born of pure desperation. The wood groaned in protest. A rusty nail scraped against her palm, drawing blood, but she barely felt it. Splinters dug into her fingertips. Finally, with a sharp crack, the board tore free. It was flimsy, a pathetic weapon against a solid oak door, but it was a tool. It was hope. She felt her way to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She listened. The noise from the town had quieted, settling into a low, expectant hum. They were waiting for the dawn. She didn't have much time. She jammed the sharp end of the board into the narrow gap near the top hinge, leveraging it with all her weight. The old iron groaned a pained metallic screech that seemed deafening in the silence. She froze, listening. Nothing. She put her shoulder into it, pushing, twisting. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the grime. Her muscles screamed. A screw loosened by decades of damp popped from the wood with a faint ping. Hope, fierce and whole white-hot, surged, tutsled through her. She worked relentlessly, her hands raw and bleeding her breath, coming in ragged, audible pants. It felt like hours. The world was reduced to the singular agonizing task, the board, the hinge, the unyielding door. Then, with a final soul-shaking shriek of tortured metal, the top hinge gave way entirely. The heavy door sagged inward, its own weight pulling it from the lower hinge, opening a dark, vertical slash, just wide enough for her to squeeze through. She scrambled out, gulping the cool, clean air of the silent store. Freedom. Moonlight, pale and ghostly, sliced through the front windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She crept to the glass, peering out. The street was deserted, cast in long, eerie shadows. A single lamp burned on the porch of the saloon, where a knot of 3 men, a self-appointed guard, sat slumped in their chairs, their rifles resting across their laps. But the livery stable at the far end of town was dark and silent. That was her only chance. She slipped out the back door of the store, a wraith in a torn calico dress. The alleyways and shadows that had been her childhood refuge now served a more desperate purpose. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed dirt as she flitted from one pool of darkness to the next. Reaching the livery felt like a monumental victory. The large door was unlocked, held only by a simple wooden latch. The familiar smell of hay and horse washed over her a strange comfort in the midst of her terror. She knew these animals. There was old Bess, the blacksmith's gentle mare, steady but slow. There were a half-dozen other unremarkable mounts. And then there was Diablo. He stood in the largest stall, a living shadow, a fiery black gelding the sheriff had acquired in a poker game. The horse was as mean, powerful, and unpredictable as its owner. No one in Redemption Gulch dared ride him, but Garrett himself. Kaylee didn't have time for steady. She needed lightning. She approached the stall slowly, her hand outstretched, murmuring low and soft. Diablo's head snapped up, his eyes gleaming in the dark. He snorted a plume of hot air and stamped a hoof. He smelled the fear on her, but he also sensed something else, the quiet, steely confidence she had learned from the wilderness, a language animals understood better than men. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice a firm, calming thread in the darkness. "We have a job to do. We have to run." Finding the sheriff's heavy saddle and bridle, her hands worked with a frantic, fumbling efficiency. The horse sidestepped and fought her, but she was persistent, her touch sure. She led him out into the moonlit yard, the silence of the night stretching taut around them. With a grunt of effort, she swung herself into the saddle. For a moment, she thought the gelding would throw her, but she held on her small frame, anchored by sheer will. She urged him not toward the main trail, but straight out into the open desert, toward the jagged black moor of the canyons. The race had begun. At the first hint of dawn, Sheriff Cole Garrett stood before his assembled posse, a figure of dark authority. 30 men, their faces a mixture of grim determination and nervous excitement, looked up at him. Horace Bartholomew was among them, his face pale and sweating, a heavy rifle held awkwardly in his hands as if it might bite him. "Men!" Garrett bellowed, his voice ringing with a false, stirring righteousness. "We ride today for justice for our friend Frank Miller. We ride to show the Navajo that they cannot cross our lands, harm our people, and then hide behind a treaty written on paper. The girl the traitor confirmed they're holing up in the canyons near the Three Sisters. We'll flush them out like the rats they are." We ride. With a ragged roar, the posse kicked their horses into motion. They were a wave of vengeance, a creature of singular, ignorant purpose, raising a cloud of dust that choked the morning air as they thundered toward the lands of the Diné. Kaylee, meanwhile, was engaged in her own desperate battle. She pushed Diablo harder than she thought possible. The goat path was a nightmare, a narrow, crumbling ledge with a sheer drop on one side that fell away into purple shadow. The powerful gelding was surprisingly nimble, his iron-shod hooves striking sparks on the flinty rock. But every step was a gamble. Loose scree clattered from under his hooves, a sound that echoed for a terrifyingly long time as it tumbled into the abyss. The wind was a physical force trying to tear her from the saddle. The sun climbed a merciless eye in the sky, beating down on her. Her throat was a desert of its own, raw and parched. Her body was a symphony of aches. But she didn't slow. In her mind's eye, she saw two things: Kaya's calm, trusting face and Sheriff Garrett's cruel, triumphant sneer. The images fueled her. She clung to Diablo's mane, her knuckles white, and rode on. She finally cleared the canyons, just as the sun reached its zenith, bursting onto a high mesa that overlooked the wide plain. Diablo was lathered in sweat, his flanks heaving. Below her, she saw them. The posse. They were a dark centipede crawling across the ochre desert floor, still a few miles from the treaty line, a demarcation marked by a series of whitewashed stone pillars. She had beaten them. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her, washed through her. But it was followed by a dreadful sense of impotence. She was one girl on a stolen horse. What could she possibly do? It was then she saw it. On the far side of the treaty line, on the long, high ridge that overlooked the entire plain, something was moving. At first it was just a shimmer in the heat haze, a trick of the light. Then the shimmer resolved into definite shapes. A rider on a pony. Then another. Then 10, 20, 50, 100. Within minutes, the entire length of the ridge was lined with them. It was the Navajo. They sat on their ponies in a silence that was more profound and menacing than any war cry. They were utterly still, a living frieze against the piercing blue sky. The sun glinted off the polished metal of a rifle barrel, here the sharp flint tip of a lance there. The occasional flutter of an eagle feather in a warrior's hair was the only movement. This wasn't a raiding party caught by surprise. This was a nation assembled and waiting. They knew. The posse saw them at the same time. The confident, boisterous chatter died instantly, swallowed by the vast silence. Horses were pulled up short, their riders' faces slack with disbelief, then a dawning, sickening fear. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of flushing a few savages from a canyon. This was the brink of a war they could not possibly win. The men looked at each other, their bravado evaporating like a raindrop on a hot skillet. "Hold the line!" Garrett shouted, his voice suddenly shrill. He drew his pistol, the silver plating flashing in the sun. His half-dozen paid thugs followed suit, their faces hard. But the townsfolk, the blacksmith, the store owners, Horace Bartholomew were hesitating, their rifles suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "It's an ambush!" one of Garrett's men yelled, giving voice to the terror that had seized them all. "The girl set us up!" Garrett's face was a mask of incandescent fury. This wasn't the plan. He needed a skirmish, an incident, a few bodies on either side to muddy the waters and give his benefactors at the land company their excuse. Not this overwhelming, silent judgment. But he had come too far. To back down now would be to admit the lie. His reputation, his future, his very identity in this town was on the line. "They're bluffing," he screamed, trying to rally his crumbling authority. "It's just a show. First rank, prepare to fire on my command." From the ridge, a single rider detached from the main body and began to ride slowly, deliberately down the slope. He carried no rifle. His hands were open at his sides. A single eagle feather was tied in his long, dark hair. As he drew closer, Kaylee's breath caught in her throat. It was Kea. He rode with an unassailable dignity, his back straight, his gaze sweeping over the posse with a calm, assessing power. He was not the exhausted man she had pulled from the quicksand. He was Naat Ani, a leader, the embodiment of his people's will. He halted his pony just on his side of the whitewashed treaty stones. Garrett, seeing his target, his scapegoat raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Kea's heart. "That's him, the killer fire," he roared. But before a single finger could tighten on a trigger, a new sound cut through the suffocating tension, the frantic, desperate drumming of hoofbeats from the side. Kaylee, screaming a wordless cry, urged Diablo into a final, desperate gallop. She charged straight into the no-man's land between the two groups. With a savage pull on the reins, she brought the black gelding to a rearing, screaming halt, deliberately placing her own small body directly in Garrett's line of fire. "No!" she shrieked, her voice tearing from her raw throat, a sound of pure, defiant command. "You will not shoot!" Garrett stared, his face a grotesque canvas of disbelief and rage. "Get out of the way, you little traitor!" "She is no traitor!" A new voice called out, clear and strong, carrying across the plain with an authority that silenced all others. It was Kea. He looked past Garrett, his eyes locking onto the faces of the terrified townsfolk. "She is Jilgai, the one who saved me." He sat taller in his saddle. "I am Kea Deswood of the Todich Aini clan. 4 days ago I was trapped in the sinking mud of your creek. I would be dead, my bones bleaching in the sun, if not for this girl." She did not help a Navajo. She helped a man. She showed Kay the sacred bond of kinship when your lawman preaches only hate. She asked for nothing in return. A confused murmur rippled through the posse. The men looked from Kaylee's fierce, dust-streaked face to Kea's noble bearing, and then to the silent, watching nation on the ridge. The foundations of Garrett's lie began to crack. "He's lying to save his skin," Garrett bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "He killed Frank Miller. The girl is his whore. Look!" He fumbled in his vest pocket, pulling out the turquoise necklace. He held it up for all to see, a flash of brilliant blue against the dusty landscape. "This is his payment for her treason." Kea's eyes narrowed. That was not payment. It was a gift of honor, a sign that she would be known as a friend to the Diné, that she would be protected. As for your missing man, we have seen no one. We have harmed no one. Your sheriff seeks a war that you will lose. He seeks it not for justice but for greed. At that moment, a man at the back of the posse, a young deputy named Miller, who had long been troubled by Garrett's callous ambition, found a courage he didn't know he possessed. He urged his horse forward. "Sheriff," the deputy said, his voice shaking but clear enough for all to hear. 3 weeks ago, you had me wire $100 from the town's account to a man in Prescott. You said it was for new supplies." He swallowed hard. The name on the wire. It was Frank Miller. The world seemed to stop. A collective gasp went through the posse. Every man from the blacksmith to Horace Bartholomew turned as one to stare at Garrett. The lie so carefully constructed was utterly and irrevocably demolished. There was no murder. There was no raid. There was only the sheriff's stinking, corrupt ambition. Garrett's face went from white to a blotchy apoplectic purple. He was ruined, exposed. His authority, his power, His entire world had crumbled to dust in a single sentence, with a primal scream of pure, unadulterated fury. He swiveled his pistol, his eyes wild with hate. He aimed it not at Kea, the man who had outmaneuvered him, but at the source of his ruin, the small, defiant girl who had started it all. He aimed it at Kaylee. He never fired the shot. From the silent line on the ridge, there was a single, almost imperceptible movement. An old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, had raised a long rifle with a speed that defied his age. There was a single, sharp crack, a sound less like a gunshot and more like a stone splitting in the heat. Garrett's pistol, as if struck by an invisible hammer, flew from his grasp. He screamed a high, thin sound of shock and pain, clutching a hand that was suddenly a mangled wreck of blood and bone. The standoff was over. The lie was broken, instantly. Two of Garrett's own townsmen, not his paid thugs, who were already looking for an escape, surged forward, grabbing the fallen sheriff and hauling him from his horse. Kea rode forward, crossing the line of whitewashed stones. He stopped his pony beside Kaylee's panting gelding. He didn't look at the chaos of Garrett's capture or the stunned, ashamed faces of the posse. He looked only at her. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but her eyes were clear and steady. A strong heart. Kea said, his voice soft, a small, profound smile touching his lips. Stronger than rocks. Kaylee looked from him to the 100 silent riders on the ridge, and then to the people of her town. They were no longer looking at her with scorn or suspicion. They were looking at her with a dawning, humbling awe. 5 days ago, she had been an orphan, invisible and alone. Today she had stopped a war. The entire tribe had arrived not for vengeance, but to bear witness to the truth and to honor the sacred bond she had forged with one of them in the sinking mud. In the quiet aftermath, justice was swift. Sheriff Garrett and his paid men were taken into custody by the townsfolk themselves, their shame turning to a cold fury at having been so masterfully deceived. Horace Bartholomew, exposed and humiliated, could not meet Kaylee's gaze. The town of Redemption Gulch had been forced to look into the mirror of its own fear and prejudice, and it did not like what it saw. The Navajo did not want land or reparations. They wanted the sanctity of the treaty to be honored, and for the truth to be known. Kea, along with a council of elders, met with the town's leaders. They spoke not of anger, but of the balance that had been disturbed and now by Kaylee's actions restored. As a final gesture, an elder woman with eyes that held the wisdom of generations formally offered Kaylee a place among them, a home in the heart of the Diné nation, not as a guest, but as family. It was a tempting offer, a life free from the ghosts of her past. But as she looked at the chastened faces of the townspeople, she saw a different path. She politely declined, choosing instead to stay. Her work wasn't finished. Redemption Gulch, like its name suggested now, had a genuine chance at redemption, and Kaylee realized she was no longer an outsider, but the very seed from which a new, more honest community could grow. She had found her place not by running from her world, but by bravely forcing it to become better. If this story of unknightly courage and the bonds that can bridge any divide moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, as it truly helps our channel grow. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of the incredible power of a single act of compassion. And most importantly, click subscribe and ring the bell for more true tales from the annals of history that prove heroes come in the most unexpected forms. Thank you for listening.